public in a population of 5.3 million.
Thank you. That concludes questions, and we move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 8470 in the name of Mary Fee on housing. And I would invite members who wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Mary Fee to speak to and move the motion up to 14 minutes, although this debate is very tight for time.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's motion seeks to address what's been missing from this chamber in the last 15 months. A debate on housing addressing the present and future challenges. While Scotland experiences a housing crisis, the biggest since the end of World War II, we have a housing minister absent and a government ducking its responsibilities on housing. Housing should be at the centre of government policy because it creates jobs and stimulates local economies. Scotland is in pause, and that's clearly evident in the housing portfolio. In the last year, 13,478 houses have been built. That's the lowest number since 1947. And between 2008-2009 and 2011-12, the capital housing budget was slashed by 29% under the SNP stewardship. Since taking on the role of Housing and Welfare Minister in September 2012, Margaret Burgess has failed to front a debate on housing. Paul Martin, MSP, Patrick Harvey, MSP, and the Equal Opportunities Committee have been proactive, far more than the Housing Minister, on bringing such serious debates to this chamber. The lack of leadership in the government is impacting on local communities, local people and local economies as we speak. This lack of leadership and the entrenched lack of ambition has been criticised by Audit Scotland, as well as industry bodies. Philip Hogg of Homes for Scotland said, "Tackling this issue will require bold vision, commitment and action from all parties in order to halt the decline of what is a key national indicator." And that's why Scottish Labour are calling for a national housing action plan that's comprehensive, ambitious and inclusive, in order to invest in our communities and reinvigorate housing in Scotland. Indeed, I look ahead to the Minister's response on this call. And going back to the point of low ambition, I must refer to the Scottish Government's White Paper on separation. In the section on housing in an independent Scotland, there are a total of 7 paragraphs, or 10 if you feel generous enough to include those on fuel poverty and energy prices. There's also a very nice picture of a tenement building. And that amounts to 1.5 pages in a 670-page document, or 0.2% on housing. I'm sure... Yes?
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. Would she accept that one of the underlying principles in the White Paper is that we would have more money if we were not subsidising nuclear weapons? And if we had more money, one of the priorities would be housing.
Mary Fee.
I thank the member for that intervention. And if he wants to talk about housing, can I just point out that Scottish Labour wouldn't have wasted £30 million on Garrel, which has hardly demonstrated a fiscally responsible government. And we are calling for the National Action Plan on housing, and it must be comprehensive and ambitious. And while we cover ambition and the White Paper, which was very, very light in housing matters and gave us no answers as to what the government's priorities will be, and it does nothing to alleviate the concerns of Scottish house builders, which were raised in the recent Jones-Lasang survey, which showed that most house builders believe that Scottish independence would result in fewer housing developments. In fact, only 1 in 12 house builders thought independence would deliver more housing. And couple that with the survey and the IFS report warning that Scotland may have to make further spending cuts. The prospect of Scottish independence doesn't paint a great picture of the future of housing in Scotland, especially when we already know of the potential challenges facing supply and demand over the next 50 years. Presiding Officer, across the chamber, there's agreement that we need more housing in all its shapes and sizes, and nobody would disagree that well-built, affordable housing can have a positive impact on health, well-being, employment and education. However, we do have disagreement on how we can achieve those housing targets. The SNP manifesto for the 2011 election promised to build 6,000 socially rented homes each year. Yet what we have instead is an edit to build 6,000 affordable homes. And 1 year before the Minister took her role, Shelter Scotland and the Chartered Institute for Housing were warning the Government on their pledge that unless there was a radical rethink on spending priorities, they wouldn't meet their target on affordable homes. This may part explain why we now find ourselves in the biggest crisis in Scottish housing since the end of World War II. And going back to the Audit Scotland report, we learn it could be 20 years before enough new homes are built to meet the changing demographics and projected population increases. The crisis in housing is reflected by Audit Scotland when they report that the number of new homes built by the private sector has more than halved, and councils and RSLs have built 14,000 fewer homes than needed since 2005. Yes, certainly.
John Wilson.
Would the member accept that at least local authorities are building houses now, more than they did in the last 4 years of the Labour Liberal Democrat administration in this Parliament?
Mary Fee.
We could all bandy statistics around this chamber. I think the important thing that we have to remember
Order, please.
if we hadn't tabled this debate today, we wouldn't be talking about housing. No, I've just taken one. When the Minister reported in July, when this was reported in July, there was the Housing Minister, and why has there been no government debate to discuss the crisis that we have in housing? And on the issue of funding affordable housing, it's warning that the Government have yielded that their approach has been flawed after accepting all recommendations from the Financial Capacity, Affordability and Development Subsidy Working Group. RSLs have indicated to myself, long before the final report, that the subsidy levels were cut too far and that this was having a detrimental impact on the services they provide and the planning for future housing developments. With £3 billion of private borrowing, there was a danger that reserves would be used, and many RSLs were struggling to gain access to new lending unless they had significant reserves. In recent years, the Housing Association grant per unit has been cut from £70,000 to £42,000, with the average cost of building a socially rented home at around £125,000. The Scottish Government recently announced an increase in this grant. However, with this grant being cut, it's easy to see why RSLs are struggling to build new homes. And, Presiding Officer, the motion also raises the issue of homelessness, and statistics that show that since 2007 there's been an increase in those in temporary accommodation, albeit mostly down to the recession and the tough economic conditions that have followed. And despite legislation that guarantees anyone presenting themselves as homeless access to emergency temporary accommodation, it was reported at the weekend that our largest council has been turning people away, and I hope the Minister will address this today. The Shelter campaign, which states that 4,847 people will wake up on Christmas Day homeless, is to be commended. And in these benches, we support Shelter, who, in addition to reach out for public support, seek to challenge the guidelines on minimum standards of temporary accommodation and to give families the legal right to challenge the appalling conditions which they are often forced to live in. Parents with children and pregnant mothers need to be protected from damp and dangerous accommodation. And it's clear that with 157,700 people on waiting lists and 23,000 houses unoccupied, more needs to be done, and the need for a national housing action plan is palpable. There are many reasons for homelessness, such as relationship breakdown, income or job loss, and crucially the callous Tory welfare reform agenda. However, the effects homelessness have on many areas of aspects of people's lives cannot be overestimated, especially for children and young people. The Scottish Empty Homes Partnership, launched in 2012, has only returned 200 homes of the 23,000 estimated empty properties back into use. And last year alone, only 72 were brought back into use by councils. And it would be interesting to assess where the empty properties can be mostly found. Are they in rural or urban areas, areas of deprivation or more affluent areas? And assessing the location of these empty properties could bring around a greater emphasis on returning these homes to use. And we call on the Housing Minister to address the concerns around empty homes, and indeed whether this can be included in a National Housing Action Plan, especially when it's reported that the cost of returning a house back to the market is far lower than building a new one. And returning to population increases and changing demographics, the Census Scotland results show us that greater demand is to be expected in the future. The results underline the scale of the challenge, and for the first time ever, there are more single-person households than at any other time. Over a third of homes are now one-person households, and the increase in pensioners can be attributed to this, and this alone creates pressures on housing policy. How does the Scottish Government plan to address the expected increase of 80% of pensioners between now and 2050, with most of the increase occurring in the next 25 years? Also, when looking at the personalisation and self-directed support agenda, we need to meet the housing demands of disabled people, allowing more independence and more freedom. And, Presiding Officer, a major challenge we face in this Parliament is ending fuel poverty. The Scottish Government have committed themselves to ending fuel poverty with lower bills, and this is to be achieved through the Home Energy Efficiency Programme for Scotland. So maybe the Minister can inform the Chamber if 2016 is still the target, and if so, can the Minister explain the White Paper pledged to end fuel poverty? Is this an admission that they cannot achieve this despite their pledges through heaps? And going back to the White Paper, much was made of ending the bedroom tax, and quite rightly. This unjust policy must be ended. However, why do the SNP want to wait until 2016, and only in the event of a yes vote? Instead of playing political football with this horrid tax, will the Minister say whether she will back Jackie Bailey's bill to protect tenants now or not? Why should vulnerable Scots be used as pawns in the SNP's attempt to break up Britain? And no one in this chamber can deny that the Scottish Government can do more to mitigate against the effects of the bedroom tax. But for political reasons, no, I'm almost finished, I'm sorry. But for political reasons, they choose not to. Finally, Presiding Officer, what we have is a Scottish Government strategising for separation, not a government interested in the day-to-day running of Scotland. Housing in Scotland is in crisis. More people are on waiting lists. Fewer homes are being built than at any other time since 1947. And what's the Government's response? They want constitutional change, despite having the power to act over the last 6.5 years. In closing, Presiding Officer, we need action now to solve our housing crisis, end homelessness and reduce waiting lists. We need action from the Government to build homes, create jobs and stimulate local economies. And that's why we need a National Housing Action Plan. And finally, Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my name.
Many thanks. We are tight for time this afternoon, and if members wish to be considered to be called to speak, they must press the request to speak buttons. I call on Margaret Burgess to speak to and move Amendment 8470.2. 10 minutes, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And unlike other parties in this chamber, the Scottish Government has a clear vision that every one of us in Scotland should live in a high-quality, sustainable home that we can afford and that meets our needs. Our manifesto was the only manifesto in 2011 that had a target for building affordable homes. No other manifesto had that, and I would point out to the Labour Party in the chamber, they talked about investigating, looking at and possibly doing. They had no commitment whatsoever. So I actually welcome this. I won't take an intervention at this moment. I've been accused of not coming to this chamber and talking about housing, so I'm going to talk about what we've done about housing here today, and you can listen. So I welcome this opportunity to affirm and demonstrate that this Scottish Government leads, listens and takes action to ensure that we can deliver that vision. And importantly, we are working in conjunction with the entire housing sector in doing so. Of course, we all recognise that challenging economic conditions continue to impact on house building activity. But despite the prolonged economic downturn, this SNP government has outperformed the record of previous devolved administrations. I'll take an intervention.
Mary Fee.
Saying that when Audit Scotland, Shelter and other organisations say that housing in Scotland is in crisis, that they're wrong.
Minister.
What I'm saying is that we are building houses and more than any other administration has built in this Scottish Parliament, given the economic downturn. In fact, you can't get away from the facts of the matter, but I'll give you the facts. I'll give them the facts, Presiding Officer. 4,117 new council houses were built. The last Labour in the SNP administration, the last Labour Liberal administration in their last 4 years built 6. 26,781 housing association houses built, 15% more than the previous administration. This Scottish Government and this Minister is committed to delivering at least 30,000 affordable homes, at least 20,000 which will be for social rent. And we're making good progress. By September, we had already delivered over 16,000 affordable homes. Nearly 12,000 of these were for social rent, meaning that we're already over halfway to meeting our 20,000 target for social renting. And to ensure that we remain on track, I took the lead in confronting the issue of funding for social housing developments, recognising that councils and housing associations were facing many pressures on their finances. I set up a working group with housing stakeholders, listened to their concerns and took decisive action by increasing all social housing benchmarks by £16,000 per unit.
Hugh Henry.
Given everything that the Minister says that she has done, and given that she claims that the SNP government has a vision, why has she failed to come to this Parliament and have a debate on it?
Minister.
Because I've been out there talking to the stakeholders and trying to get the things moving. If leadership is judged by coming to the Parliament and speaking to the opposition parties, then I'm sorry. For me, leadership's going out there talking to the stakeholders, listening to their concerns and taking action. And that's what we are doing. The change enables, and the £16,000 benchmark was recommended by the group. It was their figure, and we took that on board. That change now enables councils and housing associations to keep social rents affordable, and it reduces the amount they have to contribute from their own resources, particularly given the uncertainties of the UK Government's welfare reforms. We backed this change up with investment in the draft budget. No, I'm not giving way anymore. I've been told constantly that I've not come and spoken about housing, so I'm going to do it now. Over the 4 years to March 2016, the planned investment in affordable housing will now exceed £1.35 billion. Every new build affordable home that we help to fund means more jobs in our construction industry. But it's also vital that we support a recovery in the market sector. And yesterday's housing statistics underlined the continuing impact of challenging global economic conditions and of the Westminster cuts to our capital budget on our house building industry. And the opposition parties in this chamber can't deny responsibility for part of that global recession. However, despite these difficult times, Scotland's rate of new house building per head of population continues, and this is a fact, to outperform the rest of the UK. And recently published NHBC statistics and new home registrations to the end of September 2013 show encouraging signs in terms of increasing activity and recovery. A central plank of our support for house building is our £220 million Help to Buy Scotland shared equity scheme. And I'm pleased to see the industry's positive reaction to the scheme. To date, 95 house builders have registered, with more applications still coming in. And that list includes companies from major PLCs to small family firms who may only want to build a few but still vitally needed homes. I'm taking no more interventions, sorry. I look forward to the scheme making a positive difference in the coming months and years, increasing not just the demand for new housing but also the supply. And Help to Build sits alongside other initiatives which we've supported or launched. Other shared equity programmes, the House Building Infrastructure Loan Fund, the private sector My New Home scheme. The story of our support is rich, it's diverse and it is ongoing, and throughout all of it runs the theme of innovation. For example, the National Housing Trust initiative, the first guarantee-based model for housing in the UK, is going from strength to strength, with deals being secured with 13 developers across 10 council areas, generating around £150 million of housing development. And I'll now turn to homelessness. In 2003, the first devolved Scottish Parliament unanimously and rightly set an historic target to ensure that every unintentionally homeless person should have an entitlement to settled accommodation. In 2008, Ian Gray described this as the best homeless legislation in the world, but admitted we didn't build the housing to make it work. Instead, it has fallen to this administration in tough economic times to build homes and to deliver on that historic commitment, which I confirmed almost a year ago. At the same time, we've also made progress in reducing the number of children in temporary accommodation, alongside wider falls in recorded homelessness in Scotland. For example, in 2012-13, the number of households with children in temporary accommodation reduced by 551, or 16%. These figures are going in the right direction, but of course we're not complacent. We want to minimise all time spent in temporary accommodation, and a temporary accommodation subgroup of key stakeholders, including COSLA, councils and shelter, is due to report to the Homelessness Prevention and Strategy Group this month. We will use this and other evidence to consider what further steps need to be taken on standards in temporary accommodation. We also recognise the importance of addressing rough sleeping and will continue to focus on preventing this happening wherever possible. The latest statistics again indicate continuing falls in recorded homelessness across Scotland, including falls in rough sleeping. So our record of housing leadership over the last 12 months includes boosting housing supply budgets, outperforming labour and affordable supply, staying on track to deliver 30,000 affordable homes, launching Help to Buy Scotland, expanding and developing the National Housing Trust, and achieving the historic homelessness commitment. And now, with the Housing Bill, which I introduced to Parliament last month, this SNP government will again take the lead. The bill will introduce a regulatory framework for letting agents, create a new private rented sector housing tribunal, increase flexibility in the allocation and management of social housing, and it will end the right to buy, thereby preventing the sale of up to 15,500 social rented houses over 10 years. But only independence will allow us to deliver policies which reflect Scotland's values and which support strong communities and which promote social justice. For example, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has pointed out that under the current system,
Order, please.
The opposition were very keen to comment on the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So I'm pointing out that they pointed out that under the current system, there's actually a disincentive for Scottish governments to invest in keeping social rents affordable, because the benefits of our investment go to the UK Treasury and we get back lower housing benefit spend. But thankfully, Scotland's future offers a different way forward. Independence would give us full flexibility over housing budgets, allowing us to design how we use grants, loans, equity stakes or guarantees specifically for Scotland's needs and circumstances. Presiding Officer, I can assure this Chamber that if we become the government of an independent Scotland, we will abolish the bedroom tax, integrate welfare and housing investment to support our housing system, our people and our communities. I move the amendment.
Thank you, Minister. And I now call on Patrick Harvey to speak to and move Amendment 8470.1. Maximum 6 minutes. Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to participate in this debate, though I feel I must apologise to the Chamber. I seem to have arrived in the Chamber with a speech that has nothing to say about independence, and I hope it will be acceptable if I read a speech that's only about housing. I say that in relation to both the opening speeches, I have to say. This is an important issue, and I congratulate and thank the Labour Party for bringing the issue of housing to the Chamber. But I do feel strongly that turning this into simply yet another tiresome Labour SNP spat is not going to help anyone. there is an argument to be made about the number of homes being built. It's important, and I say this to the government, to recognise that the social rented sector is about more than simply the council housing build, of which they are proud of their own figures. We also need to look at the numbers in relation to need, not only as the government amendment does in relation to the Labour Liberal Democrat coalition's record, or in relation to what's happening in other parts of the UK. We need to be looking at supply in relation to need. And yes, we should acknowledge, as I think the Labour motion might have done, that the context of ill-conceived and socially damaging cuts from the UK government is something that the Scottish Government simply can't wish away. And also acknowledge, as the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations mentioned in their briefing, they say, however, getting the affordable housing supply programme back on track is no easy matter and is not helped by the difficulties in raising private finance to complement the subsidy levels. So no Scottish Government of any political persuasion at the moment would be finding this an easy area to deal with. If there is a housing crisis, I think we also need to recognise that it's not entirely about people not having adequate and suitable accommodation available to them. My amendment leaves in the Labour Party's comments about temporary accommodation because I think that's very important. But there are also very many people who do have suitable accommodation, but for whom it's becoming increasingly unaffordable. And I want to focus most of my remarks, as my amendment focuses, on the private rented sector, which has doubled in 10 years, or thereabouts, and which is continuing to grow ever more expensive. The figures from the City Lets report show year-on-year increases in Glasgow and Edinburgh of 5, 6, 7% or more in some areas. And this at a time when incomes are static or falling for far too many people. So this rise in the private rented sector, although it is a choice for some, and we should acknowledge that there's nothing second-class about renting instead of owning a property, although it is a choice for some and we should respect that, for very many other people it's not a choice. For very many people it's the only housing that's available to them. Trapped between unavailable social rent and unattainable owner-occupation, very many people, as well as the increase in single-person households that's been mentioned already, very many people are finding that the private rented sector is their only option. Now, if we recognise that this is no longer simply a free choice in a marketplace, but the only housing that our society is providing for many people, the case for regulating the private rented sector as social provision, I believe, becomes very clear. Now, there are good and bad landlords. Members dealing with constituency caseload over the years will recognise that. And there are good and bad letting agents. But there are certainly those who regard properties simply as investments, not as homes. The imperative of homes is to provide housing for people, not to provide income for landlords who don't wish to provide a quality service in exchange. One colleague has mentioned the example of a constituent who was threatened with notice to quit, against which so many private tenants have no defence. And for what reason? Simply for seeking private rented housing panel mediation in relation to the heating system, a dispute over the heating system in the home. A landlord unwilling to provide the appropriate remediation that was necessary. The tenant simply sought mediation and was threatened with notice to quit. Of the constituents who have contacted me, and this will be a familiar story to many members around the country. People dealing with repairs outstanding for years in some cases, with landlords passing them from pillar to post and simply not resolving really vital problems, which are about the livability of housing, and I say again, of the only housing that many people have available to them. Now, the government's housing bill does include measures that I welcome. The abolition of the right to buy, the regulation of letting agents, these will be positive steps. But I would encourage the government to look at including other options in that bill. Feedback on landlords. Many people can go online when they're looking for a property and find out if their landlord is registered, but they can get little more information than that. And finding a mechanism by which tenants can provide feedback on the quality of service that they've had from a landlord or letting agent would give people the information they need to sort the good from the bad landlords who are out there. Security of tenure is another area where I think we need to provide a great deal more, as well as energy performance standards in the private rented sector. And finally, Deputy Presiding Officer, in closing, I would make a case for the reintroduction, as some European countries never abolished it in the first place, of some level of rent controls. In certain parts of the country, private rented prices are simply spiralling out of all control. And I believe that since this is, for so many people, the only housing option they have available, the case for rent controls must be brought back onto the agenda. I move the amendment in my name.
Now call on Alec Johnson. Up to 6 minutes, please, Mr Johnson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I rise unreservedly and unashamedly to support the motion in the name of Mary Fee. And I do so because, while there are many things in which we will disagree, and I will go on to discuss some of them, the terms of this motion are, as Burns would say, the chills that win a ding. The truth is that we are dealing here with a housing crisis that in no small part is caused by the government's failure to address it. And we've heard the usual rhetoric today already. We've heard the line about how they've been building council houses. Well, to be honest, I think it's the councils that have been building council houses. And the contrast that has been drawn with the housing that was built by the previous government. Of course, not taking into account the fact that over many years attempts were made to ensure that the housing associations built houses. So the numbers simply don't add up. They are not comparing like with like. We've gone on to hear the wonderful claim by the Minister that, of course, there was a manifesto commitment. No, I'll carry on at the moment. A wonderful claim by the Minister that there was a manifesto commitment to build all these affordable houses. But no. The commitment was to build social rented houses. And the government, after it was elected, with a bit of sleight of hand, changed its target so that it was easier to meet. It's not the only sleight of hand that's been involved either, because there was another piece of magic at one point, and that was when the government decided, instead of counting starts, it would begin to count completions. Now, the effect was that if you do that through the whole period, you can draw in some houses that were actually started before the period began. Or, even better, if you change mid-period, you can actually count houses that were started in one year and finished in the next, so you can count them twice over. I think the government's figures have to be studied very closely on this. There's also that inbuilt contempt for the housing associations, which, although the government will deny, when it talks about councils to the exclusion of the achievement of housing associations, then it does so in a way that undermines their contribution. It has to be said that it's never ceased to amaze me how the housing associations have, reminiscent of an old Hammer horror, swooned and batted their eyelashes as this government, like a vampire, sucks the very lifeblood from them. But let's go on and talk a bit about this government's actions and the results. Yesterday's housing statistics really are a damning indictment of this government's failure to address the housing shortage in Scotland. Under their stewardship, the supply of new homes has fallen by almost half. We should perhaps be unsurprised at that, because the Scottish Government has chosen to disproportionately slash the housing budget. Then periodically it's unveiled additions to the housing pot, quite often funded by Barnett consequentials coming from that evil Tory government south of the border. Sorry, I should have put that in quotes. The fact is that I believe that this is fiscal fancy footwork and that it is having a hugely detrimental effect on house building levels in Scotland. This degree of uncertainty is, in my view, hampering progress, and we need to only look at the Scottish Government's own spending choices to see why. Their response is not to become more ambitious. They resort to the well-worn tactic of pointing the finger at global downturns and Westminster, of course. It's the political equivalent of "a big boy did it and ran away," which is one of the three key defences used by this government on a regular basis. The long-awaited white paper on independence tells us many things. We know that we'll keep our own phone numbers, and we know that we'll still have mobile internet access, and we know we'll still be able to watch Doctor Who. But what it does not tell us is anything meaningful about how the SNP would build enough homes to house those who need them. On the other hand, we can all take comfort from the fact that an independent Scotland will in fact still be called Scotland. I believe that was in the white paper. But we should not be surprised. Housing is a devolved issue, and given the SNP's lamentable performance on housing, with the powers it already has, those languishing on the housing waiting lists can't expect a reversal in fortunes, whatever the outcome of that referendum. The SNP told us they would seek to leverage in private investment to build social housing. It's a laudable aim, but where is the money and where are the houses? The best this government have come up with so far is the National Housing Trust, which is now limping along in its third incarnation. Yes, the NHT is seeing houses built, but let's look a little more closely at it. Once a tenant has moved into an NHT property, the clock is ticking. They will have their home for as little as 5 years, and if they can't afford to buy it after that time, then they are left with little option but to move out. Let's compare and contrast that with the Conservative housing policy. The right to buy offers tenants the option of either continuing to rent their home or buy it if they chose to do so. That's why there are key areas of policy delivered by this government that are, by comparison of those with previous governments, quite unacceptable. And until this government accepts its own limitations and responsibility for them, then there is no way forward. I support the motion in the name of Mary Fee.
Many thanks. And we now move to open debate. 6-minute speeches. We're very tight for time. Maureen Watt to be followed by Richard Baker. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It was entirely predictable that the Labour Party would use their business slot today, given Mr Kelly's question on the White Paper debate last Wednesday. But the logic of doing this, quite frankly, escapes me, as this is one of these motions from the party opposite where their assertions can be demolished paragraph by paragraph. So let's just do that. Presiding Officer, I used to think that people were allowed at least a minute before interventions was the convention. Well, just to stick to that, shall we? They assert Scotland faces a housing crisis, understands the number of new homes built in 2012 was the lowest since the post-war era. Now, I wonder why this is. Wouldn't be anything to do with the complete collapse of the economy presided over by the last Labour government in Westminster, would it? The selective amnesia of the Labour Party, and we hear from the Tory party, is breathtaking. The decline in house buildings is entirely due to the downturn in the private sector housing construction, with banks refusing to lend to them, many house builders going to the wall, and a lack of confidence by house sellers and buyers as they see the value of their properties decline. But while the party opposite sits and moans, woe, woe, and 3 times woe, we watch this SNP government taking action and intervening wherever it can within its current limited powers. And we know from their record of inaction that that would be Labour Party's reaction, because even in the good times before the crisis, Labour's record on house building was woeful. It's worth repeating again and again. Labour built only 6 council houses in their last 4 years, compared with 3,724 council homes completed by the SNP government in the 6 years to June this year. 27,223 housing association homes completed in the 6 years to 2013, a rise of 16% in the 6 years from 2022 to 27, when Labour was in power. And this can be said as being typical of Labour, as in Wales, Labour have built only 8 council houses in the last few years. And when the SNP in Aberdeen called for the council to borrow to build more council homes, Labour and Tories rejected it. So despite the 26% reduction in the capital budget from Westminster, planned investment in housing over the 4 years to 2015-16 will exceed £1.35 billion. Of course we'd like to do more, but we are constrained by the financial settlement. And I'm not aware of anybody in the Infrastructure Infrastructure Committee or Finance Committee bringing forward changes to the budget to increase spending on housing, and where it would come from. Is Mr Kelly going to tell us?
Come on, tell us.
Even on, can I point out to the member, even on your own figures, you quoted a 26% cut from Westminster, but the housing budget of the SNP government was reduced by 29% between 2008 and 2011. So you passed more cuts on in housing than was passed on from Westminster.
Maureen Watt.
But funny how we're still managing to build more houses because we know how to use the money better. Mention is made in the motion that house builders are concerned about separation. I'm not aware of that, but I am aware of a press release from Homes of Scotland on the 27th of September this year saying home builders herald the launch of game-changing Help to Buy scheme in Scotland. And we know that house builders would not have adequate standards of house building if it was left to the industry itself. They admit that. But just think how many fewer houses would have adequate standards of house building, how many fewer houses, both in the public and private sectors, would be falling below tolerable standard, especially in the field of insulation, if housing standards had, since the war, been set in Scotland to cope with Scottish weather conditions, rather than those of several degrees warmer in the southeast of England. And that's why this government is having to spend so much on insulation schemes in Scotland. Then on homelessness. Now, I thought we could agree that the legislation on homelessness had cross-party support and was being well implemented across local authorities, notwithstanding some local difficulty in East Lothian. But who do we find this weekend is neglecting and ignoring that duty on homelessness? Glasgow City Council. Now, I know that organisations such as Turning Point and the GHA itself would be horrified, as both these bodies were proud of the legislation and their work to meet their obligations. And indeed, Turning Point said to us that international bodies that they met were envious of the legislation. Now, I said at the outset that this debate was predictable. Mr Kelly, like so many other of his better together colleagues, opened his mouth last week before his eyes were open to the White Paper. The White Paper, Mr Kelly, has more paragraphs than council houses built when Labour were in office. Finally, Presiding Officer, I want to address the personal attack in the motion on the Minister for Housing. Mary Fee should be reminded that in the last Parliament, her Labour colleagues frequently indulged in this practice. Little good it did them. As a woman, she really should reject the tactics of the male chauvinist dinosaurs in her party. Margaret Burgess is an inspired choice of Minister. Her career in the Citizens Advice Bureau gave her she works tirelessly. This morning she's been in Perthshire. After this she's in Glasgow. And the housing bill is coming forward. They have been working on that.
Now call on Richard Baker to be followed by John Wilson.
So I'm pleased with the chance to speak in this debate because, as the Minister knows, I've been in correspondence with her a number of times in relation to issues of housing in the North East. And while I appreciate the replies I've received, the policies she's outlined again today fall very far short of what needs to be done to address the chronic shortage of social housing in this country and certainly specific challenges we have in the North East. And the fact is that the benches opposite may not want to hear it, but the reality is that people know on the ground in our communities day in, day out, there is a crisis in social housing, and no number of excuses, no number of passing the buck will get away from the fact that this government has singly failed to deliver on this key pledge for the people of Scotland. And why you should have any confidence at all that that would be delivered in an independent Scotland when they can't deliver the powers they have now is beyond me, and certainly is not illustrated by anything in their white paper. The fact of the matter is, as Mary Fee said, we have fewer homes of social housing being built in Scotland than at any time since 1947. in last year's figures. And that's the wage of this government's decision to cut the budget for housing by a third. That is the issue at hand here. They dismissed the figures were published yesterday, which showed the extent of the problem. They dodged the issue, not in a moment, I'm just past my first minute, they dodged the issue of the amendment, the crucial issue amendment, by debating records on council house building in a way that suggests council houses good, homes built by housing associations bad. What a ludicrous debate that is. The key issue is that the homes are built and people are off the waiting list and getting into those houses. Mr Lyle, Mr Mason,
John Mason.
I do thank the member for giving way. If he had to choose between more houses in Aberdeen and getting rid of the Aberdeen-Western peripheral route, which would he choose?
Mr Mason knows that this party brought forward a clear budget proposal last year for building more homes, for increasing substantially the housing budget, and that wasn't predicated on anything which Mr Mason has suggested. You looked at our budget proposal carefully as we put it forward last year. The fact of the matter is that the previous executive built 10,000 more homes in the last year of our administration than this government did last year. And so whatever weasel tactics the government's taking on the data it's using, that's the fact of the matter. We built more social housing and they have failed to deliver on the pledges that they have made in this area. We're going to debate a number of statistics this afternoon, but let's remember about the human impact of this. I think of the young woman and her partner who for 3 years had to share their bedroom with the son and the impact that had on their lives, of the families where brothers and sisters are sharing rooms way beyond the ages which the vast majority of us would find acceptable because their parents can't secure the housing they need. That is what is happening on the ground in our communities. And there are many stories like this, because in the North East, the government's own figures show there are 1,000 households in Aberdeen defined as overcrowded and 3,000 households in Aberdeenshire defined as overcrowded, and thousands of people on a waiting list. Aberdeen City Council is proposing to build some 2,000 new social homes through their infrastructure plan. They are acting on it. I'm afraid it's the Scottish Government who are entirely failing to step up to the plate on this important issue from the North East. If you have more people on waiting lists, then surely what you do is you build more homes. Instead, the figures from the government itself state that there were only 99 social sector new build starts in Aberdeenshire in 2012 and to 13, and a round figure in Aberdeen City of 0. No social sector new build starts. That is against a figure for the number of affordable homes which are actually required, which local housing associations put out over 1,300. So it's not surprising that in July, Audit Scotland found that Aberdeen City is one of the few council areas in Scotland with a surplus of jobs, but the area received the lowest allocation per head of population for new homes in 2012 to 15 plans, and that is a lower allocation of a diminishing budget. Briefly to Mr Harvey.
I'm grateful. Given the lack of affordable, by which I take it he means socially rented homes in his area, does he agree that there is a need to address the private rented housing prices, which in his area can be £800, £900 a month?
That as well. Mr Harvey makes a good point, and that's why the issue of homes for social rent was very important, and that, of course, is a very pledge which the government made, which it's failed to deliver on. So I do think the issue of rents is very important as well, because in Aberdeen we've had the highest increase in house prices outside London, and now we have the highest rents in Scotland. And for those who already live in the North East but are on low incomes, who aren't benefiting from that strong local economy, it makes it all the more difficult for them to get the housing they need. But when this government decided to cut the Housing Association grant to build new homes from £76,000 when Labour left office to just £44,000, it didn't take a rocket scientist to work out that was going to mean fewer homes would be built. And that's what happened. Housing associations told you it would happen, and it did happen. Now, finally, ministers have accepted that, and they've changed that decision, so the cut in the grant's been reduced, so the new level is £58,000. But I say to ministers, that figure will have to be revised again and looked at again if it does transpire that the 30,000 new homes target can't be met. And if that target is met simply by, this comes back to the points Mr Harvey raised, by actually building homes for mid-market rent, then it's not actually addressing the need which is there. So, Presiding Officer, I hope this government will do more to support the housing associations of the North East, who stand ready to move forward with projects to deliver the social housing our part of Scotland needs. I hope ministers will rethink an approach to housing which has been marked by swinging cuts and a lack of delivery. The
Must
people
close
who are
now,
sitting on
please.
housing waiting list today don't need a change in the Constitution. They need a change in the policy of this government to actually deliver the homes that they need.
Many thanks. Now call on John Wilson to be followed by Jackie Bailey. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Despite what the Labour Party states in its motion today, it should be noted that the Scottish Government have brought forward numerous housing debates to this chamber since the time I was elected, and if my memory serves me correctly, my first debate that I've spoken was on housing. So I welcome any debate which allows for greater discussion and scrutiny on the issue of housing. In many ways, the current direction of housing was set by the Scottish Government in terms of its discussion paper in 2010, Housing, Fresh Thinking, New Ideas. When examining housing and the issues surrounding it, then we need to look at the historic context. The UK Government's policies over the last 30 years have repeated policies of large-scale voluntary stock transfers, which have produced many changes in the provision of social housing. Moreover, there was a constant push by the two Scottish Executive Labour administrations towards large-scale voluntary stock transfers of housing stock being marketed as community ownership. Some people may say this was pushing the model of community ownership a bit too far. In fact, we had Wendy Alexander as a Labour Housing Minister pushing for the right to buy to be extended to housing associations. In terms of the critique offered by Labour today in its motion, this chimes well with a well-worn theme developed previously. There was a criticism that the Housing Association grant has been reduced, and Richard Baker has just made reference to the Housing Association grant. I remind members the Housing Association grant is a public subsidy, and when it first came into existence, it was not supposed to be there forever and a day. And throughout the previous Liberal Labour administration, they were on a downward path. There needs to be recognition that the Scottish Government's capital budget was reduced in substantial terms by the UK coalition government, hence the reason to look at these budgets and the high funding that is being made available to housing associations and others. This issue ties up with the wider issue of housing affordability. People cannot afford rents at the current rates in the private rented sector, as Patrick Harvey has alluded to. And in this current financial climate, it brings more financial pressure to those who are in the private sector trying to keep a roof over their head. Therefore, more people are finding themselves applying to the council house waiting list and look to social housing to get a roof over their heads. In this respect, I welcome the fact the Scottish Government, through various discussion papers, has highlighted fairer rents, although rent setting is limited in many respects to the landlords individuals rent their homes for. Additionally, it is worth noting that the future community growth area in the area where I live, a community growth area which was proposed in 2006 by private developers, is now finally going out to consultation this month. The possibility of delivering 2,600 private houses in an area of essential housing need basically has been delayed and delayed by local authority inaction to sit down with the developers and discuss the issues surrounding those developments. So in relation to house building, we have to look at the very issue of what's hampering some of these developments, including the issue of the international financial crisis and the situation we faced in 2008 and the effects of 2008. But there have been housing developers who have been keen to move forward and develop housing who have been hampered because local authorities, in many respects, have not had the vision to take on those developments and look at how they can assist house builders to go ahead. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government does not operate in a policy vacuum. Scotland is severely constrained under the current devolved settlement. This is even more apparent in terms of the benefit changes announced by the UK Government since its emergency budget in June 2010 and almost every other subsequent financial statement by the current Chancellor of the Exchequer. A more responsive and effective welfare system is not helped by the arbitrary changes in the benefit system, such as the so-called bedroom tax. The right to buy legislation introduced in 1979, and this addresses the point Alec Johnson made in terms of the wonderful policies pursued by successive Conservative governments, while actively promoted and supported by some in this chamber, has meant increased waiting lists for social housing. Since legislation was enacted, and this is clearly impacts on homelessness targets set for local authorities under housing legislation. It is important that we advocate a position of tenure neutrality, and I would state that the view that in Scotland we have had for far too long a tenure policy rather than a fully structured housing policy. It is only now, with changes to the right to buy made by this present Scottish Government, that we might get an influential game changer that will assist people now and for future generations. I welcome today's debate and look hopefully to, if you want to make an intervention...
You're in your last minute. No, you're not, Mr McNeill. He's in his last minute.
Right, okay. Sorry about that, Mr McNeill. I welcome today's debate and look hopefully to the debate on this subject being taken forward in the coming months and years, and that we can develop a housing policy which benefits all sectors, but in particular those families and individuals who rely on the social housing sector for their accommodation and a roof over their heads.
Now call on Jackie Bailey to be followed by Chick Brodie. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Presiding officer, the paucity of the SNP's ambition in housing policy is deeply depressing. And again, we have the tired old mantra that if only we had independence, everything would be better, the sun would shine, Scotland would win the World Cup, and housing would be improved. And yet, you know, housing is devolved. There really is nothing to stop the SNP from taking action now. So, like Patrick Harvey, I want to focus on what you can do. Now, since the advent of devolution, the Scottish Parliament has passed some of the most progressive homelessness legislation in the world. And indeed, along with ending child poverty, eradicating rough sleeping and tackling homelessness, they were major objectives of the first Labour Scottish Executive. We established a homelessness task force to review the nature and causes of homelessness, and their recommendations fundamentally changed our approach, delivering for the first time a rights-based framework, putting us very much at the forefront of the global fight against homelessness. We phased out priority need. They told us we couldn't do that, and no longer are homeless applicants assessed and categorised, regardless of the underlying cause of their homelessness. All are now entitled to settled accommodation. And the current government has built on that. They've introduced housing options, and on the face of it, it's an approach which is needs-based, it's rooted in prevention. But, you know, and I say this genuinely, there is a sneaky suspicion that this is masking the true level of homelessness and the figures are being massaged. Now, whether that is right or not, I hope that the Minister will commit to urgent research in this area, because the SNP must not be complacent on this. And whilst I am proud of our achievement, it is not a case of job done. There are huge challenges ahead. As the cost of living increases, with incomes declining in real terms, we will see more people, more families plunged into crisis. For some, austerity will mean being driven from their homes with mortgage repossessions. For others, they will just be unable to sustain their tenancies. Now, anecdotal evidence suggests that there are more people sleeping rough on our streets, contrary to what the Minister has said. And I don't need to tell you, I hope, how brutal an existence that is. Suffice to say that a man sleeping rough outside Glasgow Central Station a few weeks ago died of hypothermia. Now, this is 21st century Scotland. The SNP must do better than this, because I want the SNP government, and I've asked this of the Minister, to instruct a count of rough sleepers. Why won't you do it? What you do is you stick your head in the sand in denial that there is a problem, and the problem is growing. There is no data to inform action. Indeed, there's no specific action by the government on rough sleeping. Now, an overview of homelessness data over the past 10 years, which I commend to the Minister to look at carefully, shows that whilst the number of applications and homelessness assessments has reduced, the number of households assessed as intentionally homeless has actually increased. The most recent quarterly data on homelessness reported that of the 5,500 unintentionally homeless households whose case was closed, 76% secured a local authority, housing association or private let as an outcome, and that is to be welcomed. But that means that 24% didn't achieve a positive outcome, a proportion that has remained the same over the past 6 years. Now, Presiding Officer, what's happening to these people? Again, the Scottish Government don't know. This is an area requiring the Minister to take urgent action. And it's her responsibility, it's the Government's responsibility, it's not Westminster's or anybody else's. This is in their power to do now. Changes to housing legislation, along with the lack of social housing and increasing demand, we know has triggered an exponential increase in the number of households in temporary accommodation. According to the Government's own statistics, as of June of this year, there were 10,494 households in temporary accommodation. That's a significant increase since 2007, and we need to understand why. These households, in turn, contain 4,574 children. That figure is 1,000 higher than it was a decade ago. Now, I said earlier that homelessness is not simply about bricks and mortar, but you do have to ask serious questions of the Government when they take decisions to slash their house building budget in recent years by tens of millions of pounds. And whilst that number of temporary households remains so high, it does genuinely seem a perverse decision to make. Temporary accommodation will, for many, represent that crucial first step away from homelessness and towards a home. And if we are to minimise the trauma that we know is associated with becoming homeless, we have a duty to ensure that the standard of temporary accommodation is as high as possible. And this is especially so when we consider that many individuals, many families, can spend not just months, but perhaps even years in temporary accommodation. The evidence is there. We know the serious impact that this has on a child's development and on a child's well-being. So I genuinely say to the Minister, in light of that, in light of the growth of temporary accommodation, it is absolutely critical that the Scottish Government do not delay further and introduce statutory standards for temporary housing. Finally, Presiding Officer, housing in Scotland is in crisis. There is urgent action which the Scottish Government and the Minister can take. The Minister today has demonstrated breathtaking complacency. I hope she will finally take the veil from her eyes and do something to help people in Scotland.
Many thanks. Now call on Chick Brodie to be followed by Jim Hume. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, may I congratulate Mary Fee and indeed the Labour Party for bringing this debate forward today. I do so, Presiding Officer, because I believe it takes a certain type of chutzpah, of bravery, of skill even, to seek to rewrite selectively the history of management of the housing sector while trying to pursue the aims of this motion. So, where shall we start? Well, we know that, as has been said, if we start with local authority build completions, and if Mr Johnson wants the starts, I have the information here. In Scotland, we know that on a calendar year basis in 2006, 2 years before the financial crisis, Labour built only 6 local authority houses, as was stated. They only started 28. In 2012, we built 1,096. We started 1,211. Now, let me bring it a bit closer to home. As Mary Fee will certainly know, and specifically in the west coast of Scotland, none were built in that period of 2006, repeating that wonderful success of 2004 and 2005, when they also built none. Let me get through some. I'll take it in a minute. In that same region, we built 93 in 2012. Then let's look at the Housing Association completions again, and I can quote the stats. In 2007, there were 413 completions. In 2012, there were 900, more than double achieved than under the previous administration. I'll take an intervention.
Grateful to the member for taking an intervention. Can he tell us, in the matter of being accurate in historical matters, can he tell us how many social rented housing in Scotland was promised in the SNP manifesto on which he was elected?
Yes, we said over a period of time we would build 30,000 houses. And that's what we said we'll do. Now, let's look at that anyway. I mentioned the Housing Association. But rightly, Mary Fee, of course, includes in our naming of a so-called crisis, that at least I hope she would, and I noticed that Alec Johnson for Conservatives, missed the very point, that in her expansive critique, there was not a not-so-detailed commentary of the private housing or indeed the private rented sector, which, of course, has seen a severe decline and is one of the main, if not the main component in building stats and the consequent effect of the figures that we've heard of completions since 2007-2008. Mary Fee quotes the Audit Scotland report of July this year on housing. So let's look at what it says in the round. What does it say? It says, I quote, the recession has affected the availability of housing, and the sector is now working with constraints on lending, competing and increasing demands on capital resources and reducing government subsidies, not issues that are controlled in this chamber. Mary Fee and the Labour Party need now to be honest with themselves. Who helped cause the 2008 recession? A UK Labour government defaulting on the financial regulations that it should have been imposing. Who now can liberate lending for mortgages? It's the Westminster government, although it now, no, not just now, I now welcome the involvement, I think, of the Governor of the Bank of England, although his intervention has yet to be proven in terms of release of capital for private sector mortgage lending. I would argue this current economic stimulus that we see via so-called mortgage lending is a mirage and the creator of a housing bubble.
James Kelly.
The member talks about the last Labour government. Can he tell us if he supported the government action to rescue HBOS and the Royal Bank of Scotland, vital parts of the Scottish economy?
Check Brodie.
Mr Kelly will know, or Mr Kelly should know, that banks, where they incur debts and liabilities, are in the countries where they operate. And they didn't do all their operations in Scotland. Anyway, who cut Scotland's capital budget allocation by 26%? It wasn't this government. I've done that. And, presiding officer, to continue the litany of statistics, and I'm sorry about that, contained in the Audit Scotland report referred to in Ms Fee's notion, it refers to the impact that welfare reform will have, for example, putting further pressure on the sector, in fact, by default, on the whole sector. £50 million income to tenants dropped by 2014-15 as a result of the bedroom tax, which you discovered 6 months after we did. Not my statistics, but that of Audit Scotland. And so the report goes on about the other pressures of additional households, the increase in the number of single-person households, the change in demography, and so on, all pertinent to providing a stable economy and the housing sector. There were several of the meaningful subjects and concerns raised when I and some of my colleagues met with the House Builders Association not all that long ago. I cannot recall a member of the Labour Party attending that meeting. They didn't talk of the impact of independence on the housing market at that time. What they did talk of was a lack of clarity in lending and mortgage support. So I can just lastly appeal to the Labour Party.
Last 30 seconds.
I'm coming to the end, Presiding Officer. In the face of the challenging economic activity that affects us, why don't you work with us, instead of working with that lot, to get a meaningful, stable, growing economy that can provide this kind of sector that we want to see in housing, rather than shore them up? I beg to support.
Many thanks. Call on Jim Hume to be followed by John Mason. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's a pleasure to participate in this consensual debate this afternoon. I don't know if I'm going to help that anyway either, I'm afraid. I think it's telling that whilst in the midst of a housing crisis with tens of thousands of people languishing on waiting lists across the country, it has taken opposition business to smoke this matter out of St Andrew's House. In the past 15 months, since the Housing Minister took on her new role, I've done more speeches on housing at conferences than in this chamber. So I congratulate I'm in my first minute. I congratulate Mary Fee in bringing this debate to the chamber, and the Scottish Liberal Democrats will be supporting her motion later today. Just last month, the Scottish Government published its latest housing bill, and there are some useful measures contained within that. The overdue regulation of letting agents, the ending of the right to buy, and more local flexibility in social housing allocations for landlords. However, none of this in any meaningful way will drive down the appalling length of Scotland's housing waiting lists. The Housing Minister's own press release highlighted that there are 400,000 people on waiting lists for housing, association and council homes, which is an astonishing figure. What the quarterly housing statistics never tell us is just how long they have been on those lists. Information that I obtained last year revealed that 2/3 of the 180,000 people on these council house applications had done so for over 12 months. That's a 6% increase on the year before. Over 60,000 of those applicants had been waiting for over 3 years. Imagine having arrived at the decision your living circumstances are no longer adequate and an application for a new home is necessary, then consider 3 years later you are no further forward in extricating yourself from those circumstances. And you can begin to imagine the damage this will be doing to the welfare of families across this country. But why we have arrived at this point, as others have said, we can probably begin with the 29% real terms cut in the housing budget. This led to the destructive policy decision of cutting the subsidies to councils and housing associations in 2010. This cut from 70,000 to just 40,000 has had serious consequences. A 29% reduction in completions of homes for social rent, a 42% reduction in housing association completions alone over the past 3 years, and a decline of the public sector housing stock in each year under the SNP government. Yes, the Minister announced in the summer an increase to subsidy levels, albeit still some way short of the 2010 levels. And if this situation is bad now, we need to be mindful of what lies ahead further down the track. With people living longer and Scotland's population continuing to grow, it's estimated that an additional 500,000 homes will be needed by 2035. And research done by the previous Scottish Government before the recession and subsequent needs for more social housing revealed 8,000 new homes for social rent were required each year to satisfy demand. The Government's target is to build half of that. On another note, the Minister must check her facts and bring more balance to the debate. She says in her amendment that only 6 council houses were built in the last 4 years of the Labour-Lib Dem administration. That in itself is wrong and continually fails, as all other SNP members have done, to acknowledge the 19,704 approvals of new housing association homes under the administration in that time. That's nearly 20,000 homes for social rent. And I gently remind the Minister that there is a target for the 5 years of this Parliament, and it remains to be seen whether this will be achieved, given the recent decline in housing association homes. And just to remind members as well, in the 8 years under the Lib Dem Labour coalition, regarding housing association new build approvals and local authority new build starts, the figure is 33,118. So this government has some way to match that record yet. So let's not just concentrate on council houses. It was also housing association houses that were built in the past. And prior to last week's publication of the White Paper, we were promised that it would answer all our questions, that it would detail what an independent Scotland would look like. Well, last week, over 400,000 people were asking how they would find a new home in an independent Scotland, and they're still asking this week. Despite this being heralded as an historic document, the most important in Scottish history since the declaration of Arbroath, its 670 pages yielded 3 on housing. And in those 3 pages, the Scottish Government goes to great pains to highlight the constraints imposed upon them that hamper their ability to provide affordable housing. I don't recall Westminster compelling the SNP to renege on the manifesto commitment to build 6,000 homes for social rent every year. I don't recall Westminster compelling the SNP to cut the subsidy provided for each home. To conclude, would it not be fair to surmise that with just 3 pages of the White Paper devoted to housing and the failure of this Scottish Government to bring a debate before this chamber, that they simply do not have the answers, the commitment or the passion to solve this crisis?
Many thanks. Now call on John Mason to be followed by Hugh Henry. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start off by saying that in my own constituency I do welcome the developments that are taking place Parkhead Housing Association, Shettleston Housing Association, Glasgow Housing Association all have been building homes, and also specialist provision from Loreto Housing Association, amongst others. And in particular, I would want to reiterate, underline the welcome to give to the Commonwealth Games Village, which is now nearing completion, and which after the Games will provide 700 homes, 400 for social rent, 300 for sale. On top of that, a 120-bed care home to serve the East End. And because there has been so much interest in these homes in the East End, we now understand that developers are showing wider interest in the wider area. And that's very, very encouraging. One of the things we really wanted to see from the Commonwealth Games, giving a boost to the area. But of course, we all do want to see more done. And there are a number of factors why more houses have not been built and cannot be built at the moment. The first is the general economy. Somebody mismanaged the UK economy. Now, I do not agree with the way the Conservative government is trying to fix it, but it was under the previous Labour administration that things went badly wrong. And let's just remember too in passing that when the economy also went badly wrong in Ireland, one of the problems was that too many houses were built, houses that no one could afford, and in some cases now houses that are being demolished. So let's not be too simplistic as we look at the numbers. Secondly, housing associations are finding it harder to borrow. This in itself has a number of reasons. One is that the banks themselves are more wary of lending because some of the bad lending they've done before, despite the fact that housing associations are traditionally very safe borrowers. Also, another reason for the reduction in lending may be the bedroom tax and concern that tenants will be unable to pay their rent, and that in turn makes the banks and other lenders less certain about housing association income flows. Just yesterday evening, I attended a housing association committee, and they reckon that 1/8 of their tenants are affected by the bedroom tax. Some, in fact most, are getting help through discretionary housing payment, but that's only intended to be short-term assistance. And there is some evidence that some tenants at least are refusing to apply for discretionary housing payments because they consider the bedroom tax so morally wrong. A third factor why more houses cannot be built is that the Scottish Government's budget has been cut. And we have to be realistic about the money. I have to live within my means, as do all members here. So do housing associations, so do councils, and so does the government. All of us have to live within our means. We would all like to spend more money on many things, and housing would certainly be a priority, top priority for myself, as that continues to be the main issue that constituents raise with me. However, if more is to be spent on housing, less is available to be spent elsewhere. Yes.
In the member's comments.
Microphone.
Sorry, Presiding Officer. Nicola Sturgeon, the Deputy First Minister, recently said that you would build your way out of the recession. Could you perhaps tell me when that building is going to start?
John Mason.
Well, I've said it has started. I've just got 700 new homes being built right now, in fact more than that in my own constituency. So that is going on. But what I'm trying to argue is we are constrained by the amount of money we have. And that is the reality. We all have to live within our means. And if more is to be spent on housing, less has to be spent on something else. And what exactly does the opposition mean by the phrase in their motion, a comprehensive, ambitious and inclusive national housing action plan? Now, Jackie Bailey at the beginning of her speech said she's going to tell us what we can do. And I was listening and waiting to hear what that would be, but all she did for 6 minutes was describe the problem. She rushes back to her seat to intervene. Absolutely.
About standards for temporary accommodation? How about actually looking at what's going on in the homeless register? How about actually dealing with rough sleeping that your government is doing nothing about? How about that?
John Mason.
No.
I suspect the Housing Minister will be very sympathetic to any suggestions of how we can do things better. But the key problem, as far as I'm concerned, I'm on the Finance Committee, I think I'm the first person to have spoken from the Finance Committee, the key problem here is a lack of money. And I did intervene, I think, earlier on in Mary Fee, and she suggested that one way of having more money for housing was if Garrel had not been cancelled. Now, that is a very interesting idea. Is she saying that Garrel should not have been started in the first place by SPT controlled by Labour? So was that a Labour mistake to cancel it? Or is she saying that it should have been completed and therefore there would have been less money available for housing because that money would have gone into Garrel? I mean, what a bizarre suggestion. Or is Labour suggesting that we drop the Southern General Hospital and put more money into housing? Are they suggesting we drop Glasgow-Edinburgh rail electrification and put more money into housing? Now, these would all be options, albeit not my options, But at least it would help if Labour would tell us where the money was to come from.
Members in his last minute.
Thank you. Sorry. Alternatively, does Labour want the existing housing budget to build more homes? How is that to be done? Would they reduce the Housing Association grant levels when the Government has only just recently increased them again? Would Labour cut them again? I have to say I agree with Maureen Watt's comments that it's disappointing to see a personal attack on the Minister. It should be possible to debate these issues and to disagree on how we deal with them, even to attack government policy, but we should not be necessarily attacking the person. Turning just briefly to the Green Amendment, I'm very sympathetic to that. A lot of the antisocial behaviour problems I have in my constituency do relate, I think, to private rented sector.
To a close, please.
So, in conclusion, there are many issues around housing which need work. For me, it is one of the top priorities. Let's have less personal attacks on ministers and more practical suggestions as to what can be done. Thank you.
Excellent. Many thanks. Colin Hugh Henry now to be followed by Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Chick Brodie in his contribution said that he wanted to speak about facts and set out the case of the promises that had been made and let things be measured against that. Well, he then said that the SNP claimed that they would build 30,000 more houses. However, I think if he was going to be completely open and transparent with this Parliament, then he would have included the phrase that Alec Johnson reminded us of, and that is socially rented houses, whatever the figure was, whether it was 30,000 or else, because that is key and that is the promise that was abandoned without any explanation. And it would have been helpful if the Minister at some point would come back to the Parliament and explain exactly why that promise was abandoned. Now, John Mason said, you do not attack the person, you attack the policies, or you attack the administration, the organisation, whatever. That's fair enough. Except, Presiding Officer, that the Minister, Margaret Burgess, said this afternoon to this Parliament that in the 15 months since she was appointed, the reason that she didn't come here was that she was too busy actually going out and meeting people who really mattered, rather than coming to this Parliament to discuss the key issue of housing. Now, apart from showing a fundamental contempt of this Parliament, which, to be honest, she's not alone in the SNP administration in doing that, it actually does display quite a profound statement of what the SNP priorities are. Because while she has been too busy to come here to talk to Parliament about housing, what we've had to do while she's meeting all these important people is yesterday debate Scotland's census, which hardly ranks higher than a housing crisis. We've had to debate for 2.5 hours to tell people, the public, that it was 1 year to the Ryder Cup, rather than debate the housing crisis. We had to discuss here something that we had no control over, the noble aspiration of Dundee being a city of culture. We had to debate the fact that we wanted to celebrate Scotland's public science engagement, rather than talking about how science and money might actually help to improve the lives of ordinary Scots by building good quality, affordable, socially rented houses. We had to debate a celebration, St Andrew's Day, a celebration of Scotland, while the Minister was too busy to come here and talk to Parliament. And it's about time that this administration actually put on the agenda of the Parliament something like housing, which is fundamental to the lives of people the length and breadth of Scotland. You know, John Bailey, the chair of the Accounts Commission, made a very pertinent comment. He said that good housing is important for individuals, for families and also for wider society. It can support economic growth, promote strong, resilient communities and improve health. The problem is, Presiding Officer, the Housing Minister can't be bothered coming back here to discuss the things that John Bailey actually talked about. And if you want to ask what can be done, then yes, there are things, and John Mason and others are right to say that there are problems with the financial circumstances, not just of the Scottish Government, but the wider public sector. But even within that, there are things that could be done, there are decisions that can be made, there are priorities that could be set out. And one of the things that the housing associations are telling us very clearly, and indeed councils, because we've heard a lot about the distinction between housing associations apparently and council housings, but they're telling us that they need the capital funding for new social housing developments to be restored, because without that they will struggle to provide the houses that are needed. But also there are little things, and Jackie Bailey has listed a whole number of things that could be done immediately, but there are also issues about the problem of mixed tenure estates coming to this Parliament, presiding officer, and discussing with us, working with us. Yes, let's work together. What can we do to enhance the power of councils to intervene and deliver improvement works that would assist the allocation of funding to help owners to deal with ongoing maintenance problems? I realise there are affordability tests that need to be built in, but yes, there are things that can be done. But unfortunately, from the Minister, we have heard nothing. We've not had the opportunity to discuss that with her. 15 months of silence, 15 months of inaction as far as this Parliament is concerned.
You're in your last minute.
15 months that it's not good enough, Minister. Now, I genuinely accept the view that we should work across the political spectrum to see what improvements can be made. And if the Minister wants to do that through the committees of this Parliament as a starting point to then produce something that can come back to the floor of this Parliament, then fine, something that we could look at working together when it comes to the budget. But we did make suggestions at the budget about the use of consequentials to improve housing. But if that's not acceptable to the Minister and to the administration, then fair enough. But let's work together. But the prerequisite of working together, Minister, is talking with each other. And 15 months of silence is unacceptable, and we cannot afford another 15 months of this.
Thank you. Jimmy Day to be followed by Jackson Carlaw, and we're extremely tight for time.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate is about much more than bricks and mortar. It is about the right of every person in Scotland to a warm, secure and affordable home. And this is a basic human right, and one that must be at the heart of building a progressive, civilised and cohesive society. It's about giving children a safe environment in which to grow up. It's about allowing young people to have the best start in life in terms of accessing employment and education or starting a family. And it is about providing our older people with a warm, comfortable and safe place to live. Therefore, the importance of housing must not be underestimated. It is central to meeting our economic objectives and to reducing our carbon footprint. It impacts on health outcomes and life expectancy. It is often critical to finding and holding down a job, and we know it impacts on how well children perform at school. So if we are all agreed about the need for good quality, affordable housing, we do need to ensure that the policy and investment priorities of central and local government reflect that. Now, I don't believe that social housing should be a safety net for those who cannot afford to buy or to rent. I believe it should be part of a necessary and desirable diversity of tenure within our neighbourhoods and within our communities. Now, I do echo the points made by other members in relation to the Scottish Government's record compared to previous administrations. I won't labour that point. And I also agree with the point made in the Government's motion that Scotland is outperforming other parts of the UK. But clearly, there are serious challenges which remain. The stark reality, I know Alec Johnson doesn't like it, of swingeing cuts in capital budgets imposed by Westminster, the challenges facing the private housing construction sector brought about by the financial crash, the reluctance and refusal of banks to release finance for social housing, exacerbating the financial pressures on smaller housing associations, and all of that is before we confront the pressures bearing down on registered social landlords as a result of welfare reform. Now, despite the cuts in capital spending imposed by Westminster, the Scottish Government has built 16,000 affordable homes. That is the answer to the question that was posed by Mary Fee when she said, when will the building start? Well, it has started, and 2/3 of those homes for social rent. That is a good record, which stands in stark contrast to that of the previous administration. In my own city of Edinburgh, we are building Mr Hume made the point that I know he's about to intervene on me in his own speech, so I won't, if you don't mind, give way. We are building council houses for the first time in a generation, and only this week in Edinburgh, the Housing Minister launched Castle Rock Edinburgh's 1,000 Homes for Edinburgh initiative, which will provide more affordable homes in the capital. That is real leadership where it matters most. Over 4 years, to 2015-16, planned investment in affordable housing will exceed £1.35 billion. I defy any member to say that that is not a significant commitment in the trying financial circumstances in which we find ourselves. Now, Mary Fee referred to the level of house building, but she omitted to mention that the collapse in the private house building sector was brought about as a direct result of the financial crisis, the blame for which can be laid firmly at the door of the present and previous UK government. Lending to the social housing sector.
Drew Smith.
I'm very grateful to Mr Eadie because a number of SNP members have made this point about Labour's global recession. Surely he understands. The First Minister argued for less regulation. Could he maybe perhaps tell me in what part of the White Paper that doesn't talk about housing sets out a plan for independent regulation of the financial sector?
Jim Eadie.
Well, all of the detail on that is actually in the White Paper, so I think you're betraying the fact that you've not actually read it. The point that I was making was simply a statement of fact, which was that the blame for the financial crisis lies at the door of Westminster. Now, I want to talk about the serious issue of lending to the social housing sector. It's an important issue that's been highlighted in advance of today's debate by the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. They rightly recognise the lack of flexibility in the UK Government lending initiatives to boost the amount of finance available to housing associations. They state UK Government schemes are, and I quote, not appropriate for most Scottish Housing Association projects and will have minimal impact in delivering new housing in Scotland. And that's because the UK Treasury rules require a minimum of £5 million in tranches which are released through those schemes. And that doesn't reflect the reality of the size and scale of the social housing sector in Scotland. So we need greater flexibility. Now, despite these challenges, registered social landlords are in good financial health, with £11 billion of housing assets protected. And there is some good news. RSLs are recording deficits which have fallen to a 5-year low. But social landlords are facing financial pressure through welfare reform, increasing the financial risks to housing associations. Again, the SFHA have been helpful in their independent analysis in demonstrating what that will mean. It will mean that there will be a loss of benefit income for working-age tenants in the sector of up to £228 million by 2017. And that increases the financial risks to housing associations. In evidence to the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee only this morning, the Scottish housing regulator confirmed that they were concerned about benefits being paid directly to the tenant rather than, is the case at the moment, being paid directly to the landlord, which of course provides a regular and assured income stream. That will have a knock-on effect on lending to housing associations. That is something else that we should be mindful of. The Government has done everything that it is legally permitted to do in terms of mitigating the impact of the bedroom tax, and I welcome that. In conclusion, Presiding Officer,
you must close. Your 6 minutes are up.
In conclusion, Presiding Officer, there are challenges, but the Scottish Government is doing all that it can in very difficult circumstances, and they should be commended for it this afternoon.
Before I call Jackson Carlaw, I have to advise the last two members in this debate that they may get 5 minutes each, but no more. Jackson Carlaw.
Presiding Officer, an unreconstructed contribution to a debate, the course of which has succeeded in clearing the public galleries. One of the earliest interrogations, if that is the right word, for it certainly felt that way at the time I found myself subject to by Margaret Thatcher's Prime Minister, was in 1982, and it was about the mechanics of her right to buy legislation in Glasgow. The right to buy was a key flagship policy in the Scottish Conservative election manifesto in 1979, and it was hugely popular. Indeed, it amuses me to point out that it led directly to Margaret Thatcher securing more votes in Scotland in 1979 than the present SNP Scottish Government did in 2011. That may come as a surprise to some members, but it is nonetheless an inconvenient truth. Mrs Thatcher need not have been concerned. The right to buy policy was indeed popular in Glasgow and across Scotland, and in the years since, some 455,000 properties have been bought, and in consequence, home ownership in Scotland increased from 35% in 1979 to over 60% today. Now, all this is a matter of historical record. But what is often left unsaid is the huge transformational effect this transfer of ownership had on the economy of Scotland. New homeowners invested in their properties much more readily and imaginatively than had councils before them. And I hear much said about the fact that the sale proceeds were not reinvested as being the root of all difficulty today. But it is a statement of fact that the record of investment in much of the housing stock being sold in 1979 was hard to perceive then from its apparent condition at the time. That investment by those new homeowners created jobs and in turn created new entrepreneurs, perhaps later, who secured financial support underpinned by their new assets and in turn established new businesses and created jobs. Now, had we been able to turn that clock back in the right to buy, as though it never were, as is implied by the approbation heaped upon it by the SNP, then all those properties would still be occupied by many of the same families. The state would have financed and still be financing overwhelming maintenance bills on ageing property, all funded by taxpayers. And all those new businesses and jobs and the wealth that arose from them would vanish from our history and economy. Scotland would be a vastly poorer country. All those nations that escaped the communist yoke after the fall of the Berlin Wall in the 1980s would today be laughing because they would have thrown over the shackles of state ownership, only to see Scotland as the one country in the Western world still clinging to poorly maintained, grim, state-owned and state-stultifying public housing at levels only seen elsewhere in Europe when gulags were the norm. Now, this is the first time I've contributed to a housing debate, and I've been listening with interest. It follows that all properties sold are usually lived in. The fact that they are now in the private and not the state sector does not change the fact that they are occupied. And if the people living in them were not living in them, then where would they be living? In other words, whether in the state or public sector, the occupants in them today would still need to have a roof over their heads. Perhaps later. The arguments about the right to buy cannot change the basic fact that Scotland faces an acute housing shortage. And surely too often overlooked in this respect is the fact that there has been both a 44% increase in those seeking to live alone and an ageing population. All too easily, we customarily talk of the issues arising from an ageing population in terms of health and the consequence of health budgets, and rightly so. However, the consequences extend way beyond health. Based on the old 70 years and 10 rule, most of us have only known an era in which the aspiration which most people continue to share begins with a starter home, leading to marriage and partnership and a family home, and then in due course for some downsizing, or for others a hope, to end their days in their family home so full of memory and personal attachment. However, our housing model has depended on houses becoming available to the market, and speaking frankly, people dying. A radically different society, one in which people consciously aspire to live alone, coupled with one in which at least one adult may live on to great age, makes that model increasingly unsustainable. If larger family homes do not become available as regularly, and if affluent singles occupy sizable properties, then we have an even more acute crisis ahead of us. It seems to me that we have to recognise now that if we are collectively going to live much longer and into an age when we are more frail and less able to manage a larger property, we need to evolve a model of living which actively anticipates that it is a natural transition rather than an exceptional one to expect to vacate a substantial family property for suitable accommodation in order to enjoy this new fourth area of life, great old age, with as much self-sufficiency as possible. And we need to plan for this by recognising that the spread of new build housing has to focus much more directly on the building of properties which make this possible, and not ghettos for the old isolated from life and people they knew, but a significant planning requirement to provide within new developments properties specifically designed for independent living in greater old age. If housing policy does not plan now for an ageing population, then not only will we have the challenge of this huge demographic change to meet within our health service, we'll be compounding it by having those in great old age living in completely unsuitable properties, however suitable they may once have been, suffering falls and encouraging huge and unnecessary maintenance bills beyond their means. And by doing so, we will have even more families unable to find the homes they desperately require. Now, I look at all the facts and all the promises and all the claims by one side or the other to have the unique recipe for housing salvation. A wave of the independence wand, or a simple change of government, or the renouncing of past policy. It's a delusion to imagine that any of these will transform our position. If we worked with a greater sense of purpose, and one free of rhetorical legislative flourishes, which see barely a brick laid as a result, if we accept that we need a hugely mixed model and one which requires bold, visionary planning and thinking and financing for the future, underpinned by wider political cooperation, then we might just make some progress.
Many thanks. I now call Mike Mackenzie to be followed by Margaret McDougall at 5 minutes each, please.
Presiding Officer, thank you. I must firstly say that I'm astonished at the wording of the Labour motion, not least because of its improper and personal attack on the Minister. And while I agree that the housing situation is serious, I must point out that this is almost entirely due to the reduction in private sector and not public sector house building. And it seems typical of Labour that in their rush to blame the Scottish Government, they're not prepared to make a proper analysis of this problem and what has led up to it. And no thank you. And that is perhaps why they manifestly failed to deal with the housing problem when they were in power. Their technique then, as always, was to throw large amounts of money in the general direction of a problem in the hope that this would cure it. The housing crisis has been growing across the whole UK since before the UK Government Barker Report of 2004. The Barker Report placed considerable emphasis on the need for the planning system to allocate more housing land. The Scottish Government discussion document of 2007, Firm Foundations, also identified this problem. A lack of a suitable supply of building land has led to unsustainably high land prices. In addition, the Institute for Public Policy Research has identified the planning system as being one of the root causes of the longer-term failure of housing policy in a series of recent reports, suggesting, correctly in my view, that the uncertainty of the planning system leads to excessive land banking, tying up valuable resources which could be much better used. No thank you. This Parliament's Rural Affairs Committee reports on rural housing identified the planning system again as one of the major causes of a failure in housing provision in rural areas. And that's why I'm glad that Derek Mackay, the Planning Minister, is taking steps to reform the planning system, whilst accepting that it necessarily takes time to implement these necessary reforms and for these to feed through into the system. But the more immediate problem, as we've heard from other members, is the credit crunch, ushered in by Labour in London, because they failed, when it was their job to do so, they failed to regulate the banks. So, no thank you. Is it any surprise then that when the housing bubble collapsed, it left in its wake an intensification of a long-standing housing problem? And is it any surprise that the Great Recession, which had a disproportionate effect on the house-building industry, should exacerbate the housing problem? Only a Labour Party hoping to rewrite history could hope to lay the blame for this at the door of the Scottish Government. And as if this wasn't bad enough, Labour's Better Together friends then exacerbated the problem further with their austerity agenda. It seems that it's more important to Labour to support the Tories in Westminster than to engage with economic reality and place the blame for this problem where it really lies. No thank you, I'm short of time. In cutting the Scottish Government's capital budget by 26% and in failing to require or adequately encourage the banks to undertake responsible lending, the UK coalition has intensified this problem even further. Not to mention the damage caused by their current plan of pumping up another housing bubble as a bribe to the South East of England electorate, which is the territory on which UK elections are fought and won.
Final minute.
I should say, Presiding Officer, at this point, that it's particularly iniquitous that some banks have taken the opportunity of renegotiating comprehensively punitive terms for housing associations as a condition for lending on new projects. Presiding Officer, against this background, the Scottish Government are due great credit in surpassing the halfway mark of delivering its manifesto commitment of building 30,000 affordable homes. I would also say that the Scottish Government's decision to end the right to buy is perhaps the most important step in achieving a good supply of public housing that has been taken for many years, something that Labour apparently lacked the will to do. Shame on them. I look forward to the further powers that independence will bring so that we can really get to grips with Scotland's long-standing housing problem.
Thank you. And finally, I call Margaret McDougall, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the convener of the cross-party group on housing, I look forward to taking part in this debate on housing, one that the Labour Party has had to bring to the Chamber since the Housing Minister, Margaret Burgess, has failed to lead a single parliamentary debate on the matter, which shows housing is not a priority for the SNP. We have heard Scotland is currently facing its biggest housing crisis since the Second World War. Under this government, the capital housing budget has fallen by a massive 29%, from £534 million to £378 million, and according to Audit Scotland, it is set to fall even further to just £250 million. New housing completions and new starts have fallen across Scotland. House building in the private sector has halved in recent years. Councils and registered social landlords have built 14,000 fewer homes than needed since 2005. It's time for this government to come forward with a plan for investment, a plan which encourages growth within the housing sector and makes sure housing is built that is adequate and affordable to meet the needs of Scotland's population. This government promised that we would build our way out of the recession. Scotland is still waiting. Of course, any new housing has to be energy efficient, and this government has set a statutory target to eradicate fuel poverty by 2016, and yet the budget is underspent. I recently attended the Scottish Rural and Islands Housing Conference, and it's clear that many of the challenges which affect urban areas are magnified within rural areas. It is much more expensive to build houses the further north you go, and on our islands, of course. And rural and remote areas have a much higher proportion of homes which have no access to mains gas and can be deemed as hard to heat. Not to mention the cooler temperatures in the winter. So they suffer disproportionately because of higher costs of building new homes and by having less efficient housing and heating methods. The minimum income standard for Remote Rural Scotland report showed that a pensioner living in a rural area had to spend 2 to 3 times as much to heat their house compared to their urban counterparts. I recently discovered that the big 6 energy companies are not providing boiler replacements to oil-fuelled and liquid petroleum gas-fuelled homes. This means many residents in the hardest-to-heat homes are missing out on a 30% increase in efficiency, not to mention savings in fuel costs. What is the Scottish Government doing to support those in this situation and make sure they don't miss out on energy efficiency schemes, which currently appears to be happening? So it's concerning that the budget for energy efficiency schemes and retrofitting has had a £10 million underspend. How do we expect to meet the targets if we are not using the budget to its full potential? This money could and should be used to reduce fuel costs for the hardest-to-heat homes. Why wasn't it? And how did this underspend occur? And how does the Government intend eradicating fuel poverty to meet its statutory requirements in 2016? To conclude, Presiding Officer, when it comes to building energy-efficient, affordable homes and fuel poverty, this Government needs to up its game to meet its own targets in building new homes and eradicating fuel poverty by 2016. Now, more than ever, we need to get Scotland off pause and restart. We need to see action now, not the promise of action after September 2014. So I support Labour's motion calling for this Government to produce a comprehensive, ambitious and inclusive National Housing Action Plan. Thank you.
Many thanks. We now turn to the closing speeches, and I call on Patrick Harvey with up to 6 minutes, please.
Somewhere, Deputy Presiding Officer, perhaps in a parallel universe, another 129 MSPs sit in a Parliament which is capable of disagreeing about the issue of independence, but still reaching rational agreements and having informed debate on other social and economic policies and finding common ground where, in fact, so many of us have it. This debate has been characterised by far too many speeches to the effect either that we could only achieve our housing objectives with independence, or that Scotland's on pause and how dare you all leave everything till after independence. I'd have to say that Jackson Carlaw's speech was the most significant exception to that trend. Although I disagree profoundly with his comments on the right to buy, he made a substantive contribution highlighting issues, problems in our housing supply which none of us can wish away and which we should all be willing to contemplate and consider on a rational basis. I give way.
Duncan McNeill.
Jackson Carlaw's speech was a good one because it also looked at sweating the assets we have. It's not just about new builds, it's actually using more effectively the homes that we have. Do you share my regret that there's a disconnect between the integration of health and social care policy and the Scottish Government's housing strategy?
Patrick Harvey.
I think that's a point well made, and it's possible that the members' committee work will further inform Parliament of his perspective on that. A great many of the contributions we heard focused on supply, and also principally on the social rented sector. Now, these are crucially important, but they're not everything. Alex Johnson told us that supply overall has fallen by over half, and he laid the blame for that at the door of budget cuts. Now, he may well be right, but it's pretty breathtaking to hear that from a supporter of the UK Government's austerity programme. Cuts are not coming by magic. They're coming because of deliberate political choices. The Minister made much of the fact that other political parties did not offer a numerical target for new build social housing in the 2000 election manifestos. However, there was one political party which not only committed to reversing the cuts to the housing budget, but showed how it could be done, and it wasn't the Scottish National Party. Maureen Watt, in a contribution which, although it suffered from a little hint of tribal aggression just here or there, Maureen Watt was the first member to mention bank lending, and that was an important point. To try and understand the housing market problems that we face without addressing bank lending, either for developers or for the mortgage market, is pretty meaningless. And we are cursed, I believe, with the dominance of a tiny number of vast mega banks instead of the diverse network of local, smaller banks, such as we see in a country like Germany, which have not had the same problems that our banking system has had in terms of lending into the real economy. John Wilson devoted some of his remarks to the welfare reform agenda, and again, it's meaningless to discuss housing without looking at the context of incomes, and that means welfare. It also means recognising the context for so many employees in the private sector who are experiencing the continued poverty pay, which many private sector employers are providing, and public sector workers who continue to see real terms pay cuts year after year. These issues directly connect to the housing problems that we need to address. I believe, and I mentioned some of this in my opening remarks, and I'll close on this in my closing speech, I believe that there are more measures that we can put into the current housing bill that will address the affordability issues that many people, particularly in the private rented sector, are facing. The kind of rents which I mentioned to Mr Baker in Aberdeen, £800 to £900 a month rent. In other cities, Glasgow and Edinburgh, we see parts of our cities where similar rent levels are happening. And it's not because the mortgage holders of those properties are paying very high mortgages at the moment. It's certainly not that. It's because of excessive profiteering. And rent controls do have a role to play. Energy performance standards as well. We can make it a clear requirement for landlords and letting agents to bring their properties up to a decent energy performance standard before they put them onto the private rented market. That would ensure, again, that the people living in those homes find them affordable to live in because of the extraordinary increases in energy costs that many people are living with. The opportunity to address eviction and harassment. There are a relatively small number of people who experience illegal eviction and harassment, but for those who do, it's a profound challenge to their ability to live a decent life, and local authorities could be given a duty to investigate unlawful eviction and harassments and the power and resources to take cases directly to the courts. In closing, Deputy Presiding Officer, can I say that I will seek I will even hold out the little hope for some actual cross-party support when I bring these measures for debate to the housing bill. There is an opportunity, at least once in a while, to put the independence issue to the side. We'll have plenty of opportunities over the next 10 months to debate it. But if we're talking about the housing bill and the measures that we need to put in place to address the real needs that exist in society, that should be a time when we put it to a side just for a wee while.
Many thanks. And I now call on Alex Johnston. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. This has been a bad-tempered barney of a debate, and I've enjoyed it tremendously. However, there are a few things that I need to address, and the first thing is that if, of course, as seemed to have been established during the course of this debate, success of any government is measured by the number of council houses built during its time in office, then I would like to make my claim now for Harold Macmillan and the Conservative government of the early 1950s, because it was who broke all records for construction of council housing in Scotland. And not only that, but had a tremendous achievement in achieving a 50% plus share of the vote in the 1955 general election. However, that was a long time ago, and I'm sure there are very few people in this chamber who can remember it, so I will give way to Chick Brodie.
Chick Brodie.
I thank Mr Johnson for taking the intervention, and of course he was absolutely right. In 1955, you've never had it so good, resulted in a lot of houses being built. But on the basis that he accepts that the number of houses being built is a measure of some success, can he tell me, against the figures of Scotland having built 295.8 houses per 100,000 population in 2012-13, compared to 201.5 only in England and 177.9 in Wales, what kind of success do you then apply to Scotland's management?
Alex Johnson.
This is the two wrongs make a right defence, where he compares the record south of the border and claims a marginal advantage in Scotland. However, let me go on to deal with some of the things that have been discussed in this debate. And one thing that concerned me tremendously were the suggestions that were brought forward by Patrick Harvey for things that should go into the new housing bill. Now, I am concerned about what's being said in relation to the private rented sector. The private rented sector has become very important in recent years, and it's done it in two different ways. Firstly, it's begun to participate in the provision of social rented accommodation, but also it's dealt with a huge number, particularly of younger people, who in the older housing market would have become homeowners, but have not been able to find the money to get a mortgage in recent years, and consequently have gone into perhaps these more expensive private rented properties, which we've heard so much about. The private rented sector has become important. It's become vital. And the private rented sector itself, the landlords, realise that reasonable, light-touch regulation is the way ahead. But I don't believe that that's what we've heard today. And if we're going to have a successful private rented sector, cooperation between the landlords and the tenants is vital. Light-touch regulation is the only way to achieve that. And if this Parliament or this Government decide to come down heavily in favour of the tenant, that may be a short-term gain, but the long-term result of that will be less property for rent, and it will be the future tenants themselves who may suffer. I need to move on, though, to talk about issues of investment.
Members not giving way, Mr.
And there, too, the private sector has an opportunity to do its bit. Because it's not as if the private sector is reluctant to deal with local authorities in terms of investment. I know for a fact that there are investment funds keen to invest in social housing and infrastructure right here in Scotland, but to make this happen, it requires stronger leadership from the Scottish Government than we have currently seen. It needs ambition, flexibility and a can-do attitude to get houses built with private funding. But so far, all we've had is the usual navel-gazing and obsession with welfare reform, recurrent during this debate once again, leaving housing and those who so desperately need a home of their own as little more than pawns in Alex Salmond's Game of Thrones. We need to know that the stumbling blocks to the Scottish Government accessing private funding, what they are. Is it the Marxist dogma they insist on pursuing at the moment? Is it the inability to understand private finance? Or is there some other reason why pension funds and other investment bodies are standing with their chequebooks open, ready to invest in social and affordable housing, but yet the houses aren't getting built? The desperate need for new social and affordable homes demands a sophisticated and a comprehensive approach. And we have heard that discussed in this chamber before, but we fail to deliver. Very briefly.
Mike McKenzie.
I'm slightly puzzled here. Are you suggesting that the pension fund should invest in these socially rented homes, and then they should be sold off to the tenants about quarter of their value?
Alex Johnson.
No, I think I should go back to what I said earlier. There is only one group in Scotland today that is funding the building of homes for their compulsory sale as near as 5 years away, and that is the Scottish Government through the National Housing Trust. What I'm talking about is the potential for housing to be developed for social and affordable tenants using private investment which is available to us today if we do the right thing to encourage that to be advanced. So I look forward to an opportunity in the not-too-distant future to be able to welcome investment programmes here in Scotland that are funded by international private investors who are willing to do their bit to ensure that affordable homes are available for rent in Scotland, even if this government is not.
Thank you. And I now call on Margaret Burgess. Minister, you have 8 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I feel after this debate that I should just go back to my first speech and read it out again, because clearly nobody listened to it in terms of what was said. I said at the outset that the Scottish Government has a clear vision that every one of us in Scotland should live in a high-quality, sustainable home that we can afford and that meets our needs. Now, that's been the vision of this Scottish Government since 2011. What I've been doing is going out there ensuring that we can deliver that. And I did take exception. I can take a personal attack. I'm big, well, I know that broad, but I'm big and I can take a personal attack. But I did take exception to what Hugh Henry said, suggesting that the people I was speaking to were more important than people in this chamber. I've been out there speaking to homeless people, people who've suffered abuse and are being on the streets. I've been speaking to rough sleepers. I've been taking to groups. I've been taking to families in waiting lists. I've been speaking to all groups of people, as well as house builders, as well as the lenders, as well as the housing associations, and as well as the developers. No, I think it's my chance to respond, Presiding Officer, to the attacks that have been made on me. And I intend doing
Mr.
that.
Henry, the Minister's not taking
I'm not taking an intervention at this time. I'm going to try and respond to some of the things that have been made.
Order, please.
I'll take the one from Mr. Henry, considering I mentioned him.
I'm glad that the Minister has actually clarified who she has spoken to, but it was her words in this chamber that actually suggested that what she was doing was more important than coming to this Parliament. And whether she likes it or not, the reason that she is a government minister is because that government is accountable to this Parliament.
Minister. I'm glad that I've clarified who I've been speaking to and that perhaps that's been accepted by the member. And I have been accountable to this Parliament. I've attended a number of committee meetings, given evidence, talked about the Scottish Government's housing vision and our policy, and we are delivering on that. And I think it's been mentioned by a number of speakers, 16,000 homes already built. And as Mary Fee said, when's it starting? It's starting. We're building. We've got help to buy. And I'll explain some of the other schemes that we've got as we go on. Jackie Baillie said that we're doing nothing about temporary accommodation. Clearly, Jackie Baillie didn't listen to what I said in my opening remarks. What I said there was we have a group set up looking precisely at the areas that she talked about, and that group includes shelter. I'm taking no more interventions. They're reporting back to the Homelessness Strategy Group. We're looking at all the issues, including the standards in temporary accommodation is being looked at. We're looking at evidence on those standards that we've been told there. We can't act in anecdotal. We need evidence. We're looking at that, and if we have to take action on it, we will. Because we are talking about people, and I'm well aware that we're talking about individuals and families. And I also am well aware that no matter what vision we have, I said,
the Minister said she's
I am
not taking
another intervention. What I've said, that I'm well aware that what we're doing, and it's clearly there are people on waiting lists, and Jim Hume mentioned a figure of 400,000. The figure I mentioned in my press release was 155,000 people on waiting lists. And of course that's too much, and of course I don't like that. And that's why I'm out there trying to see how we can get those waiting lists reduced. Because it's no consolation, and I understand it, it's no consolation to any individual for us to say that homelessness is dropping or waiting lists are falling. That person, I understand that. And to any suggestion that I don't understand that, I really think again. I do know, and that's why I'm out talking to people in those circumstances. We also had mentioned here, I've covered the waiting list part. I'll say a bit to Patrick Harvey, because I had written in my notes, forgot to say Greens had a target in their manifesto. So I do accept the Green Party did have a target in their manifesto and had a vision. But in terms of the private rented sector strategy, as Patrick Harvey has said, we launched the first private rented sector strategy since devolution was launched very recently by myself. And in that strategy, we've laid out how we hope to how we'll regulate letting agents, how we will take forward, and we know the private sector needs to grow. We're also looking, we've got a subgroup at the moment set up, or an independent group chaired by Professor Douglas Robertson on the security of tenure in private accommodation, and that group will report back, and if action needs to be taken, we will take it. I said I wasn't taking, but I'll give Patrick Harvey.
I'm very grateful. The Minister says the private rented sector needs to grow. It has doubled in about 10 years. Does she have measures that she's working on that will address the increasingly unaffordable costs that people are facing when they have no other option but to stay in the private rented sector?
Minister. We're looking at everything, and the debate will come through to the Chamber. There was a mention also in the private rented sector and standards. We are introducing and have already agreed to introduce standards in private housing, both the private rented sector and private ownership sector, in terms of energy efficiency standards and quality standards, and that again will apply to the private.
Minister, I'm sorry, if you cover your microphone with your papers, I'm afraid the Chamber's unable to hear you speaking.
Talking,
Many thanks.
Oh, well, maybe some people would be happy not hearing what I'm saying. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Richard Baker gave figures saying that the previous Labour administration built more houses than the SNP administration. It's simply not true. The facts of the case, if we take it in average, under the Labour administration, 4,068 houses a year, SNP administration, 5,019. By any that's greater. And the other issue that was raised by a number of speakers in the debate is that in some way, when we talk about council housing, we are not appreciating or supporting the housing association sector. We very much are. And I also said in my opening remarks about the number of housing associations built under the SNP administration, which still exceeds those that built under previous administrations. So the housing association sector is very important. It's pivotal to what we're doing, and we'll listen to what was being said and did increase the subsidy. And to answer Margaret McDougall's point, that subsidy is greater if someone lives in a rural area, if the application is made. We recognise absolutely it costs more to build houses in a rural area. So that we've taken on board as well. Alec Johnson talked about the compulsory sale of Scottish Government houses, the National Housing Trust. The Scottish Government guarantees the National Housing Trust. It guarantees a part of the National Housing Trust. There is no Scottish Government money in National Trust houses. It's an extremely popular way for people coming into the housing market. And it's not an automatic at the end of their terms. They know what the individuals going into National Housing Trust houses know exactly what they're going into, but also in some instances the rental period can be extended at the end. So again, I don't accept that point made by Alec Johnson. But I'm just going to finish on some of the things that the Scottish Government has done that we're accused of not doing anything. We've boosted the housing supply budgets, now £1.53 billion in 4 years. We've outperformed Labour and affordable housing supply, averaged 32% more affordable completions, kept on track to deliver 30,000 new homes, affordable homes, launched £220 million Help to Buy Scotland scheme, expanded and developed a National Housing Trust, achieved the historic homelessness commitment, invested in prevention through housing options hubs and seen a reduction in homeless applications, signalled their intention to end right to buy, provided £13.5 million for greener homes for sustainable developments, invested a quarter of a billion over this and next 2 years to tackle fuel poverty and climate change, used secondary legislation to strengthen the rights of those who live permanently in mobile homes, strengthened the rights of mobile park residents, published the first private renter strategy, provided £20 million to top up discretionary housing payments, my new homes. I could go on and on and on.
I'm afraid you couldn't, Minister, because your time is up.
This government is delivering and is leading in housing. Thank you, President.
Order, please. I now call on James Kelly to respond to the debate. 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Well, it's been a very interesting afternoon and an interesting debate. It's also been very timely because the situation in relation to housing has actually deteriorated since the Labour Party tabled its motion on Monday afternoon, because yesterday's housing statistics showing 13,378 completions were actually down significantly on the previous statistics of 14,881 completions. And that shows the scale of the problem, compounded by the fact that there are 155,000 people on waiting lists, which is a 32,000 increase since 2007. And if we continue at this rate, there will be a shortage of 160,000 homes on what we require by 2030. It is therefore not a surprise that Homes for Scotland have described this as the biggest housing crisis since World War II, and the SFHA have expressed real concern about the downward trend in housing association completions, which on the latest statistics there was a 24% decrease. Now, a lot of these issues were highlighted in the Audit Scotland report, which was published in July, and Audit Scotland concluded in that report that what was needed was effective leadership and a long-term coordinated response. Listening to the Minister this afternoon, it's clear that accountability to Parliament is not part of that response. No, I'm not taking any interventions from you, Minister. It's taken you 15 months to come to the Parliament, so I'm not going to take any interventions. Now, yes, I do acknowledge that there has been a world crisis that has contributed towards the housing problems, but it's disingenuous of the SNP to try to sit in the sidelines and say that they have had no part in the housing crisis that we have in Scotland. By their own admission, the budgets have been cut by 29%, which is more than the cuts that were passed on by Westminster. And as Richard Baker pointed out in his contribution, the HAG support levels were cut from a previous level of 70,000 down to 40,000. And I know that there's been some restoration, but if you speak to housing associations, they are struggling severely to make up the shortfall that's required to be able to bring new houses onto the market. Now, Patrick Harvey complained that the debate was getting bogged down on independence, and he's right that it shouldn't be solely focused on independence, but we can't ignore the impact of housing in relation to the independence vote that's going to take place in September next year. For a start, the SNP have taken their eyes off the ball. They've become so obsessed by independence that they're not focusing on the real issues that are affecting constituents up and down the country. And we are entitled to look at the implications of independence for house building in Scotland. And as Mary Fee mentioned, the Jones-LaSalle survey published in September tell us that major house builders in this country fear that independence would mean less houses being built. And where would that leave us in addressing the crisis? No, I'm not taking any interventions from you, Minister. As I say, it's taken you 15 months to get here. And if you look at the IFS report from a couple of weeks ago, the £3 billion black hole, that's why the house builders are concerned about the impact of independence. And even if people were looking for answers, as many members have pointed out, look at the detail of the white paper. 2.5 pages on housing, including a half-page, colour picture of housing. No detail, no numbers, no figures. And as ICAS pointed out this morning, where is the detail? Where are the numbers? And these are pertinent issues for ICAS and others to be bringing forward. Now, I think there were a number of very important issues raised in the debate. There was a substantive contribution from Jackie Bailey highlighting the problem of homelessness and pointing out that there are a good number, unfortunately, of rough sleepers in existence throughout the communities of Scotland, and also that there's been a growing increase in temporary accommodation. And these are issues that should be taken forward by the government. Yeah.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. One of the other problems are people on Council and Housing Association waiting lists. In my remarks, I quoted a press release from Margaret Burgess himself of 400,000, which she denied and said it's only 150,000. But having treble-checked, if you look at www.margaretburgessmsp.org, you will see that it says 400,000 people are on waiting lists for Council and Housing Association houses. Was the member aware of that?
James Kelly.
That is no. I'm actually speaking, Minister, in case you weren't aware of that. I thank the member for putting that on record. I do actually think there's an issue about data in relation to housing. Alec Johnson and Jackie Bailey have made pertinent points on that. We will not be supporting the Green Amendment at 5 o'clock because it takes out significant parts of the Labour motion. But I do thank Patrick Harvey for bringing forward his comments on the private rented sector. The comments he made are valid. There's been a real growth in that sector in recent years. Not everyone chooses to be in that sector, and I think he raises important issues around regulation and letting agents. And I look forward to addressing those when the housing bill comes back to the Parliament. Now, Mary Fee also mentioned the issue of empty homes, and we have 23,000 empty homes in the country, and a £4.5 million budget was actually allocated to get these homes opened out and brought into the sector, and only 200 have actually been released. So that shows that is an area where the Scottish Government have power to act just now, but have clearly not been able to take that issue forward. And that is why it's quite clear that we need to assess the issues going forward. Margaret McDougall also made some pertinent points in relation to fuel efficiency and the fact that the retrofit budget had been underspent. So there are issues clearly where the government are not on top of. And that's why we need a housing action plan to address supply, to address homelessness, to address empty homes, and to get the most out of our budget. But people out in the country will quite clearly ask the question, what is the point of the SNP Housing Minister when completions have been halved and waiting lists have increased by a quarter since 2007. Young families living in overcrowded accommodation would have looked aghast as the SNP had us debating the census. While construction workers have languished on the dole, the SNP have had us debating the Ryder Cup. And while housing associations across the country
can we settle down, please?
have struggled with their funding, hundreds of thousands of pounds have been wasted on postcards coming through people's doors, publicising the white paper. What an absolute scandal! Presiding officer, Scotland does deserve better. We need an action plan to tackle the housing crisis, and it's time for the Housing Minister to get out of her ministerial office and start addressing the problems that exist in Scotland's communities.
That concludes the debate on housing. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 8472 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8472.
Formally moved.
No members asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8472 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 8475 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a Stage 1 timetable for the Defective and Dangerous Buildings Recovery of Expenses Scotland Bill. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion, please press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8475.
Moved.
No members asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8475 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of 3 business motions. I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau to move motion numbers 8476, 8477 and 8478, setting out Stage 2 timetables on various bills in block.
Moved on block.
I propose to ask a single question on motion numbers 8476, 8477 and 8478. If any member objects to a single question being put, please say so now. No member is asked to speak against the motions, therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motions number 8476, 8477 and 8478 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motions are therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of 2 Parliamentary Bureau motions. I ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8479 on approval of an SSI and motion number 8474 on designation of lead committees.
Moved.
The questions on these motions will be put at decision time, to which we now come. There are 5 questions to be put as a result of today's business. I'd like to remind members that in relation to today's debate on housing, if the amendment in the name of Margaret Burgess is agreed, the amendment in the name of Patrick Harvie falls. The first question then is that amendment number 8470.2 in the name of Margaret Burgess, which seeks to amend motion number 8470 in the name of Mary Fee on housing be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 8470.2 in the name of Margaret Burgess is as follows. Yes, 63. No, 55. There was 1 abstention. The amendment is therefore agreed to and the amendment in the name of Patrick Harvie falls. The next question is that motion number 8470 in the name of Mary Fee as amended on housing be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 8470 in the name of Mary Fee as amended is as follows. Yes, 64. No, 55. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8479 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8474 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the designation of a lead committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.